What do you do when the people who are supposed to love you the most are just waiting for you to die? For 50 years, Elizabeth Covington was a ghost in her own home, a silent shadow to a powerful husband. But when he dies, she learns the truth. Her children see her not as a mother, but as a final obstacle to their inheritance. They call her old, they call her confused, they call her worthless, but they have no idea who they're dealing with. They are about to learn that hell hath no fury like a woman they've underestimated for her entire life. This is the story of how one woman took back her power, one devastating secret at a time. Make sure you follow and hit that notification bell because you are not going to want to miss a single second of this. The scent of wilting lilies was the first thing that felt real. It was cloying. A sweet, funereal perfume that clung to the back of her throat, thicker than the rehearsed sympathies murmured in her ear. Elizabeth Covington stood, a pillar of black wool in the cavernous entryway of her own home, a home that had never truly been hers. For 50 years it had been Arthur's. Arthur's taste, Arthur's rules, Arthur's monument to himself, built of Oregon stone and glass. Now, he was a box of ash on the mahogany mantelpiece, and the house was just a gilded cage full of vultures. They wore the faces of her family. Her son, Thomas, patted her shoulder, his touch as meaningless as the words he spoke. "He's in a better place, Mum." Chloe, his wife, hovered nearby, her eyes sharp and bright, not scanning for dust or memories, but for value. They were calculating the square footage of Elizabeth's grief. During the service at Havenwood Memorial, a sterile modern affair for a man who despised modernity, she had watched them. While others dabbed at dry eyes, Thomas and Chloe had been whispering, their heads close together, their profiles sharp with ambition. She didn't need to hear the words. She had been fluent in the language of their greed for years. It was a dialect she'd learned from their father. The last of the guests, neighbours and business associates of Arthur's, finally trickled out, leaving behind a wake of half-eaten canapés and empty platitudes. The silence they left behind was louder than the chatter had been. It was a heavy, waiting silence. Elizabeth felt a profound weariness settle into her bones, a fatigue that went far beyond the funeral. It was the exhaustion of a lifetime spent holding her breath. She moved toward the staircase, her hand tracing the smooth, cold wood of the banister, each step an effort. All she wanted was the solitude of her room. "Mom, wait." Thomas's voice cut through the quiet. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. He stood in the archway to the grand living room, the one with the 2-story windows that looked out over the manicured lawns Arthur had been so proud of. Chloe was at his side, a perfectly coiffed and polished accessory to his impatience. Elizabeth turned slowly, her expression placid, a mask she had perfected over 5 decades. "Thomas, I'm very tired." "This will only take a minute," he said, striding toward her. His voice was stripped of all its funereal softness now. It was back to its default setting, brisk, condescending, practical. "We need to be practical." Practical. That was Arthur's word. It meant efficient, it meant unsentimental, it meant his way. "The thing is, Mum," Thomas continued, stopping a few feet from her, creating a space that felt more like a boardroom than a family home. "This house, it's a lot. The upkeep, the taxes, the sheer size of it. It's too much for you to manage on your own now." Elizabeth said nothing. She just watched him, this man she had carried inside her, this stranger wearing her son's face. She saw the ghost of his father in the set of his jaw, in the dismissive wave of his hand. Chloe stepped forward, placing a hand on Thomas's arm, a practiced gesture of support. Her smile was blindingly white and utterly empty. "What Thomas is trying to say, Elizabeth, is that we've been thinking about your future, your comfort. We've found the most wonderful place for you. A place? Elizabeth's voice was a soft echo in the vast hall. Golden Meadows, Chloe chirped, her voice ringing with false enthusiasm. It's a premier retirement community, the best in the state. It has a garden, social activities, 24-hour nursing staff. It's for the best, really. You won't have to worry about a thing. We'll handle the sale of the house, of course, Thomas added, his tone implying this was a great burden he was shouldering on her behalf. Get top dollar for it. The market is hot. That equity will set you up comfortably at Golden Meadows for the rest of your life. There it was, the neat, tidy box they had built for her future. A single room, a permanent solution. Chloe, sensing a flicker of something in Elizabeth's stillness, leaned in conspiratorially, her perfume a jarring mix of designer floral and sheer audacity. Think of it as a permanent vacation. A slap. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. A permanent vacation. A dismissal of 50 years of her life, of the children she had raised within these walls, of the silent sacrifices she had made every single day. They were erasing her, packing her up with the old china and storing her away so they could get on with the business of spending her life. Grief, which had been a dull, persistent ache, was suddenly cauterized. In its place, something else flared to life, something cold and sharp and terrifyingly clear. It was fury, a pure, clean rage that burned away the fog of sorrow and 50 years of submission. She looked at her son, at his expectant face, at his wife's predatory smile, and she saw them for what they were. The next generation of her warden. She had been a prisoner her whole life. First, it was Arthur's quiet, soul-crushing psychological warfare, his little dismissals, his control of every penny, his isolation of her from her friends until her world was nothing but him. And now this. The same control, the same dismissal, just wrapped in the language of concern. She had been a victim. The realization was not a moment of weakness, but of astonishing strength. The word settled in her mind, not as a label of shame, but as a diagnosis. And once you have a diagnosis, you can find a cure. She let her single perfect tear trace a path down her cheek. She let her shoulders slump. She looked from Thomas to Chloe, her gaze clouded with a carefully crafted confusion. I don't know what to say. It's all so much, so soon. Thomas's posture relaxed. This was the mother he knew, pliable, lost. Of course, Mum, we understand. Take a day or two. But the real estate agent wants to come by on Thursday. We need to move quickly. Yes, Elizabeth whispered. Of course. You're right. She turned and continued her slow journey up the stairs, feeling their eyes on her back. They saw a frail, grieving widow overwhelmed and ready to be managed. They had no idea they had just declared war. That night, Elizabeth didn't cry. She lay in her bed, in the cold, empty space Arthur had left behind, and she listened to the house settle. It wasn't moaning in grief, it was waiting. Just like her. When the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 2, she rose. She didn't put on her slippers or her robe. She walked barefoot across the cold, hardwood floor, down the hallway, to a door she had not been permitted to open in half a century. Arthur's office, his sanctuary, the heart of his empire and his control. A simple brass knob was the only thing that stood between her and his world. Her hand was steady as she turned it. The door swung open with a soft click, a sound of final release. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and the faint, lingering ghost of his cigars. She stepped inside into the forbidden sanctum. She ran her fingers over the massive oak desk, the leather of his high-backed chair, the spines of his law books. She didn't turn on a light. She stood in the darkness, letting her eyes adjust, and felt the power in the room shift, atom by atom, from his memory to her living, breathing presence. Her rebellion had begun. The air in the lawyer's office a week later was even staler than the funeral lilies. It smelled of dust and sealed documents, of histories written and futures decided by men in expensive suits. Mr. Davies, a man whose jowls sagged with the weight of his loyalty to Arthur, sat behind a desk large enough to land a helicopter on. Thomas and Chloe were seated on one side, postures ramrod straight, radiating a greedy anticipation that was almost palpable. Elizabeth sat opposite them, small and still in her black dress, a portrait of bereaved fragility. "As you know," Mr. Davies began, his voice a low, sombre rumble, "Arthur was a meticulous man. His final wishes are laid out with exacting clarity." He cleared his throat, picking up a thick sheaf of paper bound in a blue legal cover. "I will now read the last will and testament of Arthur Covington." Elizabeth listened without expression as Davies droned on. The usual bequests to distant cousins, a donation to his alma mater. Then the main event. All remaining assets, properties, stocks, bonds and personal effects, constituting the entirety of the Covington estate, I leave to my beloved wife, Elizabeth. Chloe's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she smoothed it away. Thomas sat forward, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. Elizabeth could feel his glare burning into her, but she didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on Mr. Davies. The lawyer paused, took a sip of water, and then continued. "This bequest is made," he cleared his throat again, a theatrical punctuation, "in the trust that my son, Thomas, will guide her in all financial matters, as she has no head for such things." The air left the room. It was Arthur's voice, reaching out from the grave. A final posthumous pat on her head. A final reminder of her designated place. A slow, venomous smirk spread across Thomas's face. He shot a triumphant look at Chloe, who visibly relaxed, her posture melting back into one of smug satisfaction. The king was dead. Long live the king. "Of course," Thomas said, his voice dripping with false humility. "I will honour my father's wishes. I'll take care of everything, Mum. You won't have to worry about a thing." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document, sliding it across the polished surface of the desk toward Elizabeth. "This is just a formality. A power of attorney. It will allow me to manage the accounts, deal with the brokers, just as Dad wanted. It makes everything simpler." Elizabeth looked down at the paper. The dense blocks of text, the lines waiting for her signature. Her signature. The one thing that would transfer the keys to her cage from a dead man to a living one. She looked up, not at the paper, but at her son. She hesitated. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The mask of the concerned son slipped from Thomas's face, revealing the raw, ugly impatience beneath. "For God's sake, Mother," he snapped, his voice a harsh crack in the quiet office. Don't be difficult. Dad always said you were worthless without him managing things. Just sign it, so we can get on with our lives. Worthless. The word didn't just hang in the air, it detonated. It was a sonic boom that shattered the careful composure Elizabeth had worn for 50 years. Worthless. The word Arthur had used when she'd overcooked the roast, the word he'd hissed when she bought the wrong vintage of wine for his dinner party, the word he'd used to dismantle her, piece by piece, until she believed it herself. It was his favourite tool, his sharpest weapon. And here it was again, wielded by his heir. In that instant, she didn't see her son any more. She saw a perfect, cruel mirror of his father, the same cold eyes, the same entitled sneer, the same absolute certainty of his own superiority, and her complete lack of value. Something inside her, something that had been dormant for decades, finally hardened into diamond. The nebulous spark of anger from the night of the funeral now had a name, a face, and a target. It was no longer just about defiance. It was about demolition. She would not just escape the cage, she would melt it down and forge it into a weapon. She had to force her next breath. She blinked, summoning tears to her eyes, letting her lower lip tremble. She looked up at Thomas, her gaze full of the hurt and confusion he expected to see. She let her hand shake as she reached for the document. "You're right, Thomas," she whispered, her voice a frail, broken thing. "Of course, you're right. I'm just an old woman. I'm so tired." She pushed the paper back toward him gently. I can't read this right now. My head is swimming. Let me take it home. I need to rest." Thomas's frustration was visible, but Chloe placed a placating hand on his arm. "Of course, Elizabeth," Chloe said, her voice syrupy sweet. "You take all the time you need." She saw a victory, merely postponed. They saw weakness. They saw surrender. They saw a woman crumbling, just as they'd planned. Back in the suffocating silence of the grand house, Elizabeth walked past the living room, past the dining room, past all the spaces that had been curated by Arthur for public display. She went to her small sitting room, the one space that held a trace of herself, a worn armchair, a shelf of novels he'd deemed frivolous. She placed the power of attorney on a small side table. She didn't look at it. She stood at the window, looking out at the immaculate rose garden she had tended for years, the one part of the estate that was truly hers. Her frail, sad smile from the lawyer's office was gone. In its place was a look of glacial resolve. The plan was no longer a vague notion of rebellion. It had a purpose, a mission. She would not just deny Thomas's inheritance. She would systematically, meticulously, and completely dismantle the world Arthur had built, the legacy Thomas so desperately craved, the very foundation of their arrogance. She would prove to them, and to the ghost of her husband, just what a worthless woman could do. The revenge of Elizabeth Covington didn't begin with a bang. It began with a quiet click. The lid of a sleek silver laptop opening in the dead of night. The woman her children thought couldn't program a television remote logged into a world they knew nothing about. She wasn't the tech-illiterate widow they imagined, far from it. For years, a small inheritance from her own mother, a secret she had fiercely guarded from Arthur's prying, controlling finances, had been her silent rebellion. It wasn't a fortune, but it was hers, and she had learned to make it grow quietly in the digital shadows. She'd learned about encrypted servers, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency from the most unlikely of tutors, her grandson, Leo. 17 years old, with quiet eyes that saw everything, and a profound disgust for his parents' blatant materialism. A few years ago, he'd sat with her in her garden, not fixing her Wi-Fi, but teaching her about digital privacy. "They think the internet is for their noise, Grandma," he'd said, gesturing vaguely toward the main house where Thomas and Chloe were probably arguing about something expensive. "For their bragging and their stupid videos, but it doesn't have to be. For us, it can be for silence, for secrets." He'd set her up with a VPN, encrypted messaging apps, and a secure browser, never asking what she needed them for, simply trusting her. He was an island of quiet decency in an ocean of Covington greed, and Elizabeth had filed that knowledge away. He was an ally, even if he didn't know it yet. Now she put his lessons to use. Her fingers, which Thomas believed were only good for knitting and trembling, moved deftly across the keyboard. She became a ghost in their machine. Her first stop was Chloe's Instagram. It was a public shrine to a life they didn't yet have. Pictures of Chloe posing beside a gleaming red Ferrari at a dealership. The caption, a winking, "Window shopping for the new ride, #future estate, #Covington dynasty, #upgrades." A photo of a yachting magazine, captioned, "A girl can dream, for now, #manifesting." Elizabeth scrolled through the gallery of their entitlement, a cold, methodical calm settling over her. This wasn't just greed. It was a public performance of it. They were so certain of their inheritance they were already spending it, in front of the whole world. Next, Twitch. She found Thomas's channel, a pathetic attempt to seem young and relevant. He was playing some mindless, violent video game, but he wasn't focused on it. He was talking to his online friends through his headset, his voice cocky and loud. "Yeah, man, the old man finally kicked it," he bragged between simulated gunshots. "So, the estate is major. Once we get the old lady settled into her new place, the real fun begins. Dad had this collection, secret stuff. Gonna fund a whole new empire." A collection. Secret stuff. The words snagged in Elizabeth's mind. Thomas thought he knew his father's secrets, but he only knew the ones Arthur had wanted him to know. Elizabeth had lived with the man's true secrets for 50 years. They weren't in a bank or on a stock portfolio. They were in the one place Thomas would never think to look. She closed the laptop and walked back to Arthur's office. This time she wasn't a trespasser soaking in the atmosphere. She was an archaeologist on a dig. She turned on the desk lamp, casting a golden pool of light on the massive oak surface. Arthur was old school. His most valuable secrets wouldn't be on a hard drive, they would be tangible. She ran her hands along the underside of the desk, searching for the unfamiliar. Her fingers brushed against a slight imperfection in the wood panelling at the back of the knee hole. She pressed. A faint click and a section of the panelling swung inward, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. Inside was not jewellery or cash, but a single heavy book. A black leather ledger, its corners worn with use. There was no title on the spine. She lifted it out and placed it under the lamplight. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She opened it. The pages were filled with Arthur's precise, severe handwriting. It wasn't a record of stocks or real estate. It was a meticulously detailed inventory of his shadow collection, his true passion. Not art, not wine, but rare classic automobiles. Dozens of them. A stunning multi-million-dollar fleet purchased over decades through a web of shell corporations and stored in climate-controlled facilities across the country. A 1961 Aston Martin DB4, a 1957 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, page after page of blue-chip automotive treasures. And there, at the top of a page titled Acquisition Targets, was one entry that made the air catch in her throat. It was circled twice in stark red ink, the pressure of Arthur's pen having nearly torn the paper. Save 1968 Shelby Mustang GT 500. Then 8R02S 135001. Raven Black. The Phantom. The Phantom. A sudden, sharp memory pierced the quiet of the office. A teenage Thomas sprawled on the living room floor, a glossy car magazine open in front of him. He was pointing, his face alight with an obsessive desire she hadn't seen on him since. "Look, Dad! It's the Phantom! They say it's the most perfect 68 in existence. It just disappeared into a private collection." Arthur had stood over him, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "It's a beautiful machine, son, a symbol of power. One day, when you've earned it." Elizabeth stared at the red-circled entry. This car wasn't just an asset on a list, it was a symbol. It was the physical manifestation of Thomas's lifelong sense of entitlement, the ultimate prize he believed was his birthright, promised to him by his father. It was the crown jewel of the legacy he was so eager to claim. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a small folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it. It was a printout from a high-end auction house, Chastain's International. They were specialists in rare automobiles. The printout was for an upcoming invitation-only event, and listed as the star consignment, the final lot of the night, was a Raven Black 1968 Shelby Mustang GT 500. The auction was in 3 weeks. Elizabeth leaned back in Arthur's chair, the soft leather sighing under her weight. The pieces of her plan, once scattered and chaotic, now began to click into place, forming a beautiful, terrifying machine of vengeance. Thomas wanted his father's legacy. He wanted the symbol of Covington power. Oh, she would make sure he got it, just not in the way he had ever imagined. A slow smile spread across Elizabeth's face. It was not the sad, frail smile she had shown her son. It was not a smile of joy or humour. It was the smile of a predator that has just caught the scent of its prey. The game was on. The hum of the old house was a lonely sound now. It was the sound of absence. In the weeks after the funeral, Elizabeth had learned to distinguish its groans and sighs from the memory of Arthur's heavy tread on the floorboards above. The house was breathing, but she was holding her breath. Her plan, once a spark of cold fury, now demanded fuel. It demanded capital. Late at night, when the glow of street lights painted long skeletal shadows across the Persian rugs, she would retreat to Arthur's study. His throne, a leather wing-back chair, sat cold and empty. She never sat in it. Instead, she used his massive mahogany desk as a workstation. Her weapon of choice was not one of Arthur's antique letter openers, or his gold-plated fountain pen, but a sleek, anonymous tablet computer she had bought for cash at a big-box store 2 towns over. Her inheritance from her mother, a modest portfolio of stocks and bonds, had been her secret for decades. A little seed of independence she had cultivated in the dark, far from the blight of Arthur's control. He had never known. He wouldn't have thought to ask. In his mind, she had come to him with nothing but her name, and that was all she was entitled to. Over the years, she had learned to manage it. Not in the bumbling way Arthur had always assumed she'd handle money, but with a quiet, vicious competence. She'd taught herself about offshore accounts, about encrypted transactions, about the art of making money disappear and reappear somewhere else entirely. It was her one, true, private thing. Now, it was her war chest. But it wasn't enough. Not for what she had in mind. Not for a war of scorched earth. So she turned to another set of ghosts. The contents of her mother's jewelry box. It was a beautiful, velvet-lined casket, filled with pieces that felt like they belonged to another woman, another life, a life before Covington. She began the process methodically, a surgeon excising a tumour. She photographed each piece against a black velvet cloth. The delicate filigree of a gold brooch, the deep, milky blue of a sapphire ring, the intricate cascade of a pearl necklace. Each click of the tablet's camera felt like a betrayal and a liberation. She found a dealer online, a discreet, international buyer based in Antwerp, who specialised in unpapered estate pieces. His profile was impeccable, his communication encrypted and professional. The first piece she selected was a pair of diamond earrings. Small, elegant, a 21st birthday gift from her father. She uploaded the photos, the appraisal document she'd had secretly made years ago, and named her price. The dealer, a man known only as Mr. Blanc, replied within the hour. The offer was fair, clinical. She clicked accept, and a part of her history vanished into the digital ether. The money, converted to euros, appeared in a holding account in Luxembourg 24 hours later. It was clean, untraceable, and it was the beginning. One evening, her fingers hovered over a simple silver locket, tarnished with age. It wasn't worth much, not in dollars and cents. Its value was in the weight of its memory. She opened it. Inside, the tiny faded photograph of her younger self stared back. A girl with bright, hopeful eyes, standing in front of the stern brick facade of the public library. She was 23, and she had just been promoted to head of acquisitions. The memory washed over her, so vivid it stole the air from her lungs. She was in the kitchen of their first home, a small sunlit apartment that still smelled of fresh paint. She'd been rehearsing how to tell him, her heart thrumming with a pride that felt pure and all her own. Arthur had come home, tossed his briefcase on a chair, and loosened his tie. "Good day?" she had asked, a voice trembling slightly with excitement. He had grunted, pouring himself a whiskey. "Fine." "I have some wonderful news, Arthur." She couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mrs. Gable is retiring. They've offered me her position, head of acquisitions. It's more responsibility, of course, and a raise. Not a huge one, but it's a start." She had expected a smile, a simple, "That's wonderful, dear." What she got was a look of profound disappointment, as if she'd confessed to a crime. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes cold over the rim of the glass. He set the glass down with a heavy thud. "Acquisitions?" he'd sneered, the word dripping with condescension. "You acquire the groceries, Elizabeth. That's the job. I didn't marry a librarian. It's not just a hobby, Arthur. It's my work. I love it." "A wife of mine," he said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her, "does not need to work. It reflects poorly on me. It suggests I can't provide. Do you understand?" She remembered the way the sunlight had seemed to dim in the room. "But You will give your notice tomorrow," he had said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Find a charity. Join a garden club. Have lunch with the other wives. But this little career of yours is over." He had picked up his briefcase and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, the proud announcement dying on her lips, turning to ash in her mouth. She had quit the next day. The light in the young girl's eyes in the locket seemed to dim as she watched. Now, decades later, sitting in the dead man's chair, Elizabeth snapped the locket shut. The click was sharp, final. The memory no longer brought a tear. It brought focus. This wasn't just about a house. It wasn't just about money. It was about a stolen life. It was about the woman who loved books, the woman who had a mind for acquisitions, the woman who had been erased and replaced by Mrs. Arthur Covington. A silent, smiling accessory. She would not sell the locket. It would be her reminder. Her sanctuary, her mother's rose garden became her command centre. The neatly pruned bushes and fragrant blossoms stood in stark contrast to the cold, hard purpose of her calls. Tucked away on a stone bench, shielded by a trellis of climbing white roses, she used a cheap burner phone. "Silas," she'd say, her voice low and even. "It's Nightingale." It was the code name he'd suggested. He was her proxy bidder, a man whose entire career was built on being a ghost in an auction house. "Nightingale," his voice would crackle back, smooth and unflappable. "Good to hear from you. The catalogue for the Monterey event is finalised. The Phantom is lot 247, the main event of the evening, as expected." "And our position?" "The preliminary funding you transferred is sufficient for entry. But to play in the big leagues for a piece like that, we'll need to show considerably more strength. The pre-approval threshold is substantial." "I understand," Elizabeth said, watching a bee dance over a perfect blood-red rose. "The full amount will be in place. I will let you know when the transfer is complete." "Very good. I've made the preliminary inquiries. The interest is significant. This won't be a simple acquisition." "Nothing about this is simple, Silas," she replied and ended the call. Her next calls were to her financial advisor, a discreet woman in Zurich that she'd never met, who knew her only as Client 734. They spoke in hypotheticals and percentages, a coded language of liquidation and transfer that was as intricate as any battle plan. She was moving her pieces across the board, preparing the ground. While she pruned her roses, deadheading the withered blooms to make way for new growth, she was planning the demolition of her son's world. The sweet, cloying scent of the flowers masked the smell of gunpowder. The calls from Thomas started as a trickle, then became a flood. At first they were cloying, laced with a false concern that made her skin crawl. "Just checking in, Mother. Are you eating? Chloe's worried you're not taking care of yourself." "I'm fine, Thomas. It's just, you seem so distant. We think it's time we sat down and went through some of the paperwork, just to get it organised. I know how much Dad handled everything." She would demur, citing grief, fatigue, a headache, any excuse to delay. But her polite deflections only frayed his patience. His tone began to shift, the velvet glove slipping off the iron fist. "Mother, we need to be practical. The estate has obligations, taxes. We can't just let it sit. I've spoken to our lawyer. He's drawn up a simple power of attorney. It would just let me handle the bills, talk to the bank. It makes things easier for you." "I'll look at it when I feel up to it, dear." He didn't like that. He and Chloe started showing up unannounced, their faces masks of strained sympathy. They'd walk through the house as if they were already measuring for new furniture, their eyes lingering on paintings, on silver, on the solid, heavy presence of Arthur's legacy. "The market is just so strong right now, Mother," Chloe would say, running a manicured finger over a dusty mantelpiece. "We could get a fantastic price for this place. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. Imagine, a lovely little suite at Golden Meadows. All your meals cooked for you? No more stairs? It's a permanent vacation, Thomas would add, the phrase still sounding as obscene as it had the first time he'd said it. Elizabeth continued to play her part, the grieving widow. A little confused, a little frail. But she never signed a thing. And their patience, thin as it was, finally snapped. The official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning. Not in the mail, but delivered by a courier, a blank-faced young man who handed her a thick manila envelope and asked her to sign a form confirming receipt. Her hand trembled as she took the pen. Inside, the legalese was dense and suffocating, but the words jumped out at her, stark and brutal. Petition for conservatorship. In the matter of the estate of Arthur Covington and the welfare of Elizabeth Covington, due to advanced age and apparent cognitive decline, a demonstrated inability to manage her personal and financial affairs, a danger to her own financial well-being. They were using her grief as a weapon, her desire to be alone, her quiet, measured withdrawal from their suffocating presence was being twisted into evidence of dementia. It was signed by their lawyer, a name she didn't recognize, David Chen, Esquire. A wave of pure, cold panic washed over her. It was the old fear, the one Arthur had cultivated in her for 50 years, the fear of being powerless, of being trapped, of having her own reality denied and rewritten by someone else. They could do it. They could take everything. They could put her in a room in Golden Meadows, and she would die there, a nameless, smiling old woman with no memory and no fight left. Her secret work, the selling of the jewellery, her encrypted calls. How easily could a slick lawyer like David Chen paint that as the erratic, paranoid behaviour of a failing mind? She could see the courtroom in her head, feel the weight of a judge's sceptical gaze. She sank into a chair in the hall, the thick legal document, heavy as a tombstone, in her lap. That evening, the house felt more oppressive than ever. The walls seemed to be closing in. From his bedroom upstairs, Leo heard his parents' voices. They were in their room, the door slightly ajar, and they were on a speakerphone call. He recognized the smooth, confident voice on the other end from a commercial he'd seen. It was David Chen. The petition has been served, Chen said. She'll be rattled. The key now is to control the narrative. What do you need from us? Thomas asked, his voice eager. Anecdotes, examples of her confusion. Has she been misplacing things, forgetting conversations? All the time. Chloe chimed in, her voice sharp. The other day, I asked her about the catering bill for the wake, and she looked right through me, said she'd handle it, but she never did. And she's been selling things, little things. My mother-in-law never sold anything in her life. It's not normal. Good. That's very good, Chen purred. Selling assets without consultation points to financial instability. What about her emotional state? She's a recluse, Thomas said flatly. Barely leaves the house. Spends hours in that damn garden. Talking to the roses for all I know. She's not the same person since Dad died. She's frail. Lost. Excellent. Frailty is a powerful image for the court. We'll emphasize her fragility, her grief-induced confusion. We're not the villains here. We're the concerned children trying to protect their vulnerable mother from herself. We'll request a court-appointed psychological evaluation. Given the circumstances, it will almost certainly be granted. Leo stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding with a cold, sickening rhythm. talking to the roses. He'd seen his grandmother in the garden. He'd seen her find a piece there she never found inside the house. They were twisting it into something ugly, a symptom of madness. He looked at his parents' closed door, and for the first time he felt a genuine chasm open between them and him. These were not the people who had raised him. They were strangers, vultures. Quietly he pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking, but his movements were precise. He navigated to the voice memo app and pressed the red button. He held the phone up, angling the microphone toward the sliver of light under the door. He caught the last part of the conversation. "And if she gets a lawyer," Chen was saying, "we'll just bury them in motions, delay, delay, delay. The longer this drags on, the more her resources dwindle, and the more erratic she'll look. We got this. Just keep a log of every strange little thing she does. We'll build a mountain out of these molehills." A soft click echoed in the hall as Leo stopped the recording. He saved the file under a random name, a string of numbers and letters, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The recording felt hot, toxic. It was proof. It was a weapon. And he knew exactly who needed it. For 2 days, Elizabeth lived inside a fog of fear. The legal papers sat on the hall table, a monument to her impending doom. She didn't answer the phone, she didn't check her emails. The war room in the garden was abandoned. The roses seemed to mock her with their vibrant, careless beauty. What was the point of this elaborate, vengeful game if she could be stripped of her rights with the stroke of a judge's pen? The thought of the courtroom was paralyzing. David Chen, with his slick hair and predatory smile, cross-examining her. Thomas and Chloe, their faces masks of counterfeit concern, testifying to her confusion. Every private moment of grief, every quiet eccentricity would be dissected and pathologized in public. They would call her incompetent. They would call her senile. They would call her useless. And this time, the whole world would believe it. She was in the garden, slumped on the stone bench, the fight completely gone out of her. It was over. She would call Thomas. She would tell him he could have it all, the house, the money, the power of attorney. Just leave her alone, let her fade away in peace. It was easier. It was the path she had walked her entire life. Submission. She heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. It was Leo. He'd grown so tall this past year, his shoulders broadening, his face losing its boyish roundness. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment she braced herself for the same empty platitudes his parents offered. But he said nothing. He simply sat down beside her on the cold bench. The silence stretched, comfortable, unassuming. Then he took out his phone. He didn't look at her. He just held it out. He pressed a button. David Chen's voice filled the quiet garden. Smooth, confident, vile. Frailty is a powerful image for the court. We'll emphasize her fragility, her grief-induced confusion. Then her son's voice. Spends hours in that damn garden, talking to the roses for all I know. She's frail, lost. The recording played to its sickening end. Leo turned it off. The sudden silence was deafening. Elizabeth stared at the phone in his hand, her mind struggling to process what she'd heard. The calculated cruelty, the casual, clinical dissection of her sanity. Leo finally looked at her, his young eyes holding a wisdom far beyond his years. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the fog of her fear with the clarity of a bell. "They're lying, Grandma," he said. "You're the smartest person I know." The words landed in her soul like a balm. The smartest person I know. It was the opposite of Arthur's lifelong verdict. It was the opposite of Thomas's dismissive contempt. It was validation. It was truth. In that moment, the fear didn't just recede. It shattered. It was replaced by something hard and pure and incandescent, a rage that burned away all doubt. She looked at her grandson, this quiet, observant boy who had just handed her the sword she needed to slay her dragons. He wasn't a child anymore. He was an ally, her silent co-conspirator. A slow smile spread across her face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a general who has just been handed the enemy's battle plans. "Thank you, Leo," she said, her voice steady and clear. "They've made a mistake." "What are you going to do?" he asked. "First," she said, taking the phone from his hand, "we fight back. You're good with that computer of yours. I need you to find me a lawyer. Not a slick one, a brutal one. Find me a shark who eats other sharks for breakfast." Leo's small, hesitant smile mirrored her own. "I think I know just the person." He found Anya Sharma. Her website was minimalist and stark. No smiling photos, no empty promises. Just a list of case specialties. Financial elder abuse, contested estates, undue influence. Her bio was short and to the point. Former prosecutor, founder of the Sharma Law Group, dedicated to protecting the vulnerable from predatory family members and institutions. Her motto was printed in bold at the bottom of the page. "We don't just fight, we win." With Leo sitting beside her in Arthur's study, Elizabeth made the call. When Anya Sharma's crisp, no-nonsense voice came on the line, Elizabeth didn't sound like a frail, confused old woman. She sounded like a client. "Miss Sharma," she began, "my name is Elizabeth Covington. My son has filed a petition for conservatorship against me, and I have reason to believe it is being pursued in bad faith. I have evidence. I'd like to schedule a consultation as soon as possible. I am prepared to pay your retainer in full." The practicalities of her plan now came into sharp, terrifying focus. The auction for the Shelby GT500, the Phantom, was less than 2 weeks away. It was being held in Monterey, a high-gloss, invitation-only event for the world's wealthiest collectors. It was Arthur's world, a world she had only ever observed from the sidelines. Her proxy bidder, Silas, laid out the problem in a secure video call. His face was calm, professional, but his words were a bucket of ice water. "Nightingale, access is the first hurdle. I can get a paddle, that's my job, but the funding is the real gatekeeper. For a centerpiece car like the Phantom, the auction house requires bidders to have certified funds pre-approved and held in escrow at least 72 hours before the event. We're talking a significant 8-figure sum." Elizabeth's heart sank. "Any transfer that large from my domestic accounts will raise flags. My son has eyes everywhere." "Precisely," Silas said. "It would alert him and his lawyers immediately. They could file an emergency injunction to freeze the assets pending the conservatorship hearing. Your bidding paddle would be useless." "Then the funds must come from my other sources," she said, her mind racing. "The offshore accounts, the money from the jewellery." "It's possible," Silas conceded, "but difficult. International transfers of that size take time. They are subject to intense scrutiny. We are on a very tight schedule." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "And there's another complication. A new player has entered the field. A very aggressive one. They registered just this week, deep pockets, flashing a lot of cash. They're bidding on several other high-end muscle cars in the lead-up auctions. Seems like they're trying to build a reputation fast. Who is it? Elizabeth asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The registration is under a blind trust, but the word in the circles is that it's fronting for a new collector. Someone connected to a recent major inheritance on the East Coast, brash, entitled, thinks he can buy his way into the top tier overnight. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. It was Thomas. It had to be. He must have found out about the Phantom through Arthur's old network of collectors. He was using the very power he was trying to steal from her to beat her to the prize. The ultimate irony. He was trying to buy his own dream with what he believed was already his money. "It's him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's my son." Silas's professional mask didn't slip, but a flicker of understanding crossed his eyes. Then this is no longer just an acquisition, it's a race. The next few days were a blur of high-stakes tension. Elizabeth's quiet, elegant home became the nerve centre of a complex, international financial operation. Her war room was no longer the garden, but Arthur's study, where she and Anya Sharma coordinated across 3 time zones. Anya was a force of nature, calm, methodical, and utterly relentless. She sat opposite Elizabeth at the mahogany desk, her laptop open, a secure headset on, her voice a low, steady current of commands. "Okay, Elizabeth," Anya would say, her eyes darting across a screen filled with numbers and codes. "The first tranche from the Zurich account is clear. I'm routing it through a holding company in the Caymans. From there, we'll split it into 3 smaller transfers to avoid triggering the automatic reporting thresholds." Elizabeth watched, her own role reduced to giving verbal approval. "Authorize it." "The funds from the Antwerp dealer have landed in Luxembourg. That's our cleanest money. We'll move that one last, as the final push. Leo?" Anya said, glancing at the teenager who was hunched over his own laptop, monitoring financial news feeds and transfer confirmation.
"What's the currency fluctuation on the euro to dollar exchange?"
"Stable for the last 6 hours, Leo reported, not looking up. "But there's a new federal banking directive out of DC that might slow down same-day wires over a certain amount. We need to move before the markets open in New York." They worked through the night, fueled by coffee and adrenaline. Each transfer was a roll of the dice. A compliance officer in one country, a security flag in another, could freeze the entire chain, collapsing the plan like a house of cards. The risk was immense. If they failed, the money would be trapped in a legal labyrinth for months, and Thomas would get the car. He would win. With just under 48 hours to go, they hit a wall. A transfer from a Swiss account was flagged for a random security review. "Damn it," Anya muttered, her composure finally cracking for a split second. "It's standard procedure, but it's going to cost us at least 24 hours.
We don't have 24 hours, Elizabeth said, her voice strained.
The auction was the day after tomorrow. The deadline for funding was tomorrow evening. "I know," Anya was already typing furiously. "I'm calling in a favour. A contact at the bank. It's risky, it draws attention, but we have no choice." Elizabeth paced the length of the study, the heavy silence of the house pressing in on her. She could feel the ghost of Arthur watching, a faint, mocking smile on his face. This was his world, the world of high finance and ruthless power plays, and she, the useless woman, was trying to conquer it. Hours crawled by. Leo fell asleep in his chair, his face illuminated by the glow of his screen. Finally, just as the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Anya's phone buzzed. She answered, listened for a moment, and a slow wave of relief washed over her features. "It's clear," she said, her voice hoarse with fatigue. My contact pushed it through. "The final transfer is initiated. It's on its way to the auction house's escrow account." But it wasn't over. The money was in transit, a ghost in the machine, racing across the globe through fibre-optic cables. They could only wait and watch the tracking status, a single blinking cursor on a screen that held the fate of Elizabeth's rebellion. The final confirmation came through at 4:17 p.m. Pacific time, just 3 hours before the deadline. An email with a single line of text.
"Funds verified. Paddle 72 is active."
Anya let out a long, slow breath and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. Leo, now awake, gave his grandmother a tired, triumphant grin. Elizabeth stood by the window, looking out at her garden. The roses were in full bloom, a riot of colour against the fading light. Her entire secret fortune, the nest egg she had guarded for a lifetime, was now sitting in a holding account, waiting to be spent on a machine of steel and fury, waiting to be purchased at a phantom's price. She picked up the secure burner phone and dialed Silas. "Nightingale," he answered instantly. "The funds are in place, Silas," she said, her voice perfectly calm, betraying none of the frantic tension of the past 72 hours. "We are cleared to proceed." "I see that," he replied. "We are in a very strong position. What are your instructions for the bidding?" Elizabeth looked at the silver locket she had placed on the desk, at the face of the hopeful young woman inside. She thought of Arthur's sneer. She thought of her son's greed. She thought of the word useless. "My instructions are very simple, Silas," she said, her voice as cold and hard as diamond. "Get me that car, whatever it takes, whatever the cost." The hum was almost imperceptible, a low, sterile thrum filtering through the speaker of the encrypted phone. It was the sound of a world Elizabeth had never been allowed to enter, a world of high-stakes commerce, of obscene wealth, traded for objects of desire. She sat in Arthur's study, a room she had entered only twice in 50 years. Now it was her war room. The mahogany desk was bare except for the burner phone, a glass of water, and a single, silver-framed photograph of a girl with bright eyes and a fearless smile, standing on a wind-swept Oregon beach. That girl was her, a lifetime ago. The disembodied voice of the auctioneer from a salon in Geneva was a clipped, European monotone, a sterile counterpoint to the storm brewing in her chest. But on the other end of her secure line, her proxy's voice was a calm anchor. Silas, a man she'd never met, a name recommended by her discreet financial advisor. A ghost hired to fight for a ghost. "We're approaching lot 247, Miss Covington," Silas said, his voice a low baritone, professional and devoid of emotion. "The 1968 Shelby GT 500, the Phantom. Are you prepared?" Elizabeth's gaze drifted to the photograph. She remembered the salt spray on her face, the feeling of infinite possibility. A feeling Arthur had systematically dismantled piece by piece. "I am," she said, her own voice steadier than she expected. "The estimate is 1.2 million, Silas continued. "I expect it to go higher. There is considerable online buzz. I've pre-cleared you up to 3 million. Should we exceed that, I will require a direct verbal confirmation for each increment." "Understood," the auctioneer's voice announced the lot. A murmur rippled through the audio feed, the sound of sharks smelling blood in the water. The bidding started, a frantic, almost chaotic volley of numbers. 1 million, 1.1, 1.3. "They're trying to knock out the smaller players early," Silas commented, his tone as detached as a surgeon's. "Standard procedure. I will wait." Elizabeth's knuckles were white. where she gripped the edge of the desk. She could picture it perfectly. Thomas,
Probably in his own home office, a glass of overpriced scotch in his hand, his face glowing with smug certainty. He would see this as his birthright, the final coronation gift from the father he both worshipped and feared. Arthur had always promised him the car, dangling it like a key to a kingdom. Thomas felt he was owed. 1.5, the auctioneer announced. 1.6. The pace is slowing, Silas observed. It's down to 4 serious bidders. A phone bidder in Dubai, an online participant from Hong Kong, myself, and another phone bidder here in Europe. I'm entering the fray now. Bidding 1.7. A pause. The disembodied voice confirmed Silas's bid. Hong Kong is out, Silas reported. Dubai is countering, 1.8. 1.9, Silas said into his own phone, and Elizabeth heard the echo of his bid through her speaker a moment later. It felt unreal, like a game played with phantom money. But it was real. It was the inheritance her mother had left her, a secret lifeline she had cultivated for decades. A garden of wealth Arthur had never known existed. 2 million, Dubai countered. 2.1, Silas responded instantly. Another pause, longer this time. The bidder from Dubai has withdrawn, Miss Covington. It is now between us and the other European phone bidder. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs. It was him. It had to be. No one else would fight this hard. This recklessly for this specific car. 2.3, the auctioneer called out, confirming the other bidder's move. He's aggressive, Silas noted, a hint of something, perhaps professional interest, creeping into his voice. And fast, there's no hesitation. He's not conferring with anyone. This is personal for him. I know, Elizabeth whispered. My recommendation is to show strength, Silas said. A significant jump. It can intimidate an emotional bidder. Do it. Bidding 2.6 million, Silas stated, his voice ringing with authority. The silence on the line stretched for a full 10 seconds. Elizabeth found herself holding her breath. She imagined Thomas's face, the arrogance faltering, replaced by a flash of disbelief, then anger. He would be calculating, realizing the anonymous opponent was not just some collector, but someone with deep pockets and a serious desire to win. He would assume it was a rival tycoon, another ghost of his father's world. He would never in a million years suspect it was his mother. 2.7, came the pained, reluctant counterbid. He's slowing down, Silas said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. He's bidding with his ego now, not his head. It's an amateur move. He's reaching his limit, but his pride won't let him fold. Stay on him, Elizabeth commanded. Don't give him room to breathe. 2.8, Silas bid. 2.9. Thomas's unseen voice was a desperate echo in the auction hall. 3 million. Silas's bid was like a stone dropping into a still pond. The number hung in the air, obscene and final. It was the limit they had set. We have reached the pre-approved ceiling, Miss Covington, Silas said calmly. The other party is hesitating. This is the moment of truth. What is your final instruction? Elizabeth closed her eyes. She didn't see the dark mahogany or the ghost of her husband. She saw the beach. She saw the girl who believed she could do anything, the girl who was told she was worthless, flighty, not smart enough for numbers or business. The woman who was told to be quiet, to be decorative, to be invisible. The word echoed in her mind, Thomas's voice spitting it at her just a week ago, the same word Arthur had used as a weapon for 50 years. Worthless.
A cold, clear resolve washed over her, silencing the frantic beating of her heart. This wasn't about a car. It was about buying back a piece of her own soul. She picked up the silver-framed photograph, her thumb brushing against the smiling face of the young woman she used to be. She was still in there. She had been waiting. "Win it," Elizabeth said, her voice clear and hard as a diamond, "whatever it takes." "Understood," Silas replied. There was no surprise in his tone, only the quiet satisfaction of a professional receiving a clear order. Bidding 3.2 million. A collective gasp was audible through the speaker. A stunned, shocked silence followed. The auctioneer, for the first time, seemed to falter. "I have a bid of 3,200,000, he announced, his voice laced with disbelief. 3.2 million. Is there any advance on 3.2 million? Silence. Elizabeth watched the dust motes dance in the single beam of moonlight cutting through the study window. She imagined Thomas, his phone pressed to his ear, his face pale, his mind reeling, the fury, the humiliation, the sheer incomprehension of being beaten so thoroughly, so publicly. Selling then at 3,200,000 euros, the auctioneer's voice called out, distant and final. The sharp, definitive crack of the gavel echoed through the phone. Sold. A beat of silence, and then Silas's voice, calm and victorious, filled her ear. "Congratulations, Miss Covington. The phantom is yours." Elizabeth leaned back in Arthur's chair. The leather groaned softly. She didn't feel elation or triumph. She felt a profound, quiet stillness. She had just spent a fortune, a significant portion of her secret independence, on a single, glorious act of rebellion. It was far more than the car was worth, but it was a bargain for what it had purchased. The first brick in the demolition of the Covington dynasty. The next day, the sun shone with an almost cruel brightness on the manicured perfection of Havenwood Drive. On the sprawling front lawn of the Covington estate, Thomas and Chloe were in the middle of a heated, low-voiced argument with a landscape architect. "I don't care what the zoning regulations say," Chloe hissed, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at a blueprint spread across the hood of a pristine Range Rover. "I want an infinity edge. It's not a real statement pool without an infinity edge. People will think we've settled." "The gradient is the issue, Mrs. Covington," the architect said, his voice strained with forced patience. "We'd have to excavate half the hillside." "Then excavate it!" Thomas snapped, waving a dismissive hand. He was trying to project an aura of casual, inherited power, but a frantic energy buzzed just beneath his skin. "Send me the bill. My father's estate can certainly handle it." He glanced at the house, a monument of brick and ivy, with a proprietary glare. His house, his legacy. It was then that the sound began, a low rumble that vibrated through the expensive flagstone of the driveway. A massive, long-nosed flatbed truck, impossibly large for the quiet suburban street, was turning the corner, its engine a guttural growl that drowned out the chirping birds. It slowed, its air brakes hissing, and came to a stop directly in front of their lawn. Thomas and Chloe fell silent, staring. The landscaper backed away, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. On the bed of the truck, strapped down like a sleeping predator, was a car. But it wasn't just a car, it was a legend. A 1968 Shelby Mustang GT500, its paint a flawless shimmering midnight blue, its chrome winking in the morning sun. For a moment, Thomas's brain refused to process what he was seeing. It was too perfect, too impossible. It was the car from his dreams, the one his father had spoken of in reverent tones, the ultimate symbol of power and American muscle. The Phantom.
Then comprehension dawned, and his face was transformed. The pinched frustration vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. A wild, boyish grin split his face. "He did it," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He turned to Chloe, grabbing her by the shoulders. "He did it. The old man actually did it. He bought it for me." He let out a whoop of triumph that echoed across the pristine lawns of his neighbours. "It was a posthumous gift, a final surprise. I knew it." He broke into a run, sprinting across the grass like a teenager, his arms outstretched towards his prize. "Easy now, be careful with her," he yelled at the driver, who was calmly unhooking the safety straps. As the car's ramp was lowered with a hydraulic sigh, Thomas reached its side, his hand hovering over the gleaming fender, afraid to touch it, as if it were a holy relic. The delivery driver, a stout man with a weary expression and a clipboard, stepped deliberately into his path. "Excuse me, sir," the driver said, his voice flat. "It's incredible," Thomas babbled, his eyes fixed on the car. "I can't believe it."
"He never told me he'd actually—" "Sir," the driver repeated, more firmly this time, holding up the clipboard like a shield, "I need to confirm the delivery address. This vehicle is for an Elizabeth Covington." Thomas froze. His ecstatic smile faltered, twitching at the corners. He slowly turned his head from the car to the driver, a look of profound confusion on his face. "What? No, that's a mistake. A clerical error. This is my car. It was my father's, Arthur Covington's, pride and joy. He bought it for me." The driver looked down at his papers, unimpressed. "The bill of sale is right here. Title, registration, all in the name of Elizabeth Covington. Paid in full. I just need a signature from her." "That's impossible," Chloe said, walking up behind Thomas, her face a mask of disbelief. "She wouldn't know how to buy a car like this. She doesn't even drive." The front door of the house opened. Elizabeth stepped out onto the porch. She wore a simple linen dress, her posture erect, her face calm. She said nothing. She didn't have to. In her right hand, held loosely at her side, was a set of keys. With a small, deliberate movement, she raised her hand and gave them the faintest shake. The light jingle of metal on metal was the only sound that broke the stunned silence. It was a sound louder than a gunshot. Thomas's face went through a rapid, horrifying series of transformations. The joy drained away, leaving a vacuum that was quickly filled by disbelief. The disbelief curdled into confusion, and the confusion ignited into a blaze of apoplectic rage. His face turned a blotchy, dangerous red. "What is this?" He finally managed to get out, his voice a low, strangled hiss. He took a step towards her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What have you done?" Elizabeth remained on the porch, a few steps above him, the slight elevation giving her an unassailable advantage. She met his gaze without flinching. "I bought a car, Thomas," she said, her voice even and cool. "A car?" he screamed, the word tearing from his throat. He gestured wildly at the Shelby, a monument of his stolen dreams, sitting on the driveway. "That's not a car. That's a masterpiece. That's my inheritance. That's my money you just wasted on a toy." Chloe, seeing her dreams of an infinity pool and European shopping sprees evaporating in the morning sun, found her voice. "She's senile. I knew it. Thomas, we have to call David Chen right now." This is proof. She's mentally incompetent. You spent all that money on a car you can't even drive. Thomas lunged then, not at her, but for the keys. It was a clumsy, desperate movement, the act of a spoiled child having his favourite toy taken away. Elizabeth simply took one step back, and his grasping fingers closed on empty air. He stumbled, catching himself on the porch railing, his chest heaving. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with betrayal and fury. "Give me those keys, mother." The word mother was an insult, a weapon he had always used to remind her of her place, but it had lost its power. All the old words had. "You called me worthless, Thomas," she said, her voice slicing through his rage. It was quiet, but it carried across the lawn, each word a carefully polished stone. "For years, you and your father, you looked right through me. I was a piece of furniture in this house, something to be managed, an inconvenience." She took a step forward to the edge of the porch, looking down at him. "But a worthless woman just bought your dream. A foolish, senile old woman just outbid you in a room full of the world's richest men." Thomas's jaw dropped. That was you, the other bidder." "Every penny came from my own money," she continued, ignoring his question, letting the truth land with its full, devastating weight. "Money your father never knew I had. Money I inherited from my own mother, who believed I was intelligent. Money I invested and grew myself, while your father was telling me I didn't have a head for numbers. It turns out I have a very good head for numbers." The blood drained from Thomas's face, leaving it a sickly pale grey. Chloe looked back and forth between them, her mind struggling to catch up. "This changes nothing," Thomas stammered, trying to regain his footing. "The conservatorship, the hearing is tomorrow. We'll prove you're unfit. The court will see this insane purchase for what it is. You'll be stripped of everything." "Will they?" Elizabeth asked, a faint, chilling smile touching her lips. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out her small, personal smartphone. Not the burner phone from the night before, but her own. "I don't think my lawyer will have much trouble with your petition, especially since she is now in possession of a rather interesting recording." She looked past Thomas, her gaze finding Chloe, who flinched as if struck. "A recording of you and your husband on a conference call with your lawyer, Mr. Chen. A call where you explicitly planned how to lie under oath, how to twist my grief into a diagnosis of dementia, how to commit perjury to steal my estate." Chloe made a small, strangled sound. Thomas stared at her, his face a canvas of dawning horror. "How?" he whispered. "How could you possibly?" "You should be more aware of your surroundings, Thomas," Elizabeth said softly. "You should pay more attention to the quiet people in your house, the ones you ignore. Your grandson was very helpful." The final blow. The look that passed between Thomas and Chloe was not just horror anymore. It was the sickening, gut-wrenching realization of ultimate betrayal. Not by Elizabeth, but by their own son. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and exposed by the two people in their lives they had most profoundly underestimated: the old woman and the quiet boy. The air on the pristine lawn grew thick and still. The beautiful car sat there, a silent, gleaming testament to their defeat. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. The car was merely the overture. The opera was about to begin. "You wanted this house?" she asked, her voice dropping, losing its quiet fire and turning into something as cold and hard as ice. "You were so eager to sell it, to put me away and cash in on the Covington legacy." Thomas, speechless, could only stare at her. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a dreadful premonition. Elizabeth held his gaze. Her hand went back into the pocket of her dress, and this time it emerged with a single, folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a legal document bristling with clauses and signatures. It was a simple, bureaucratic form. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately. At the top, in stark black letters, were the words, "Demolition Permit." "I sold the house, Thomas," she said, her voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "Last week."
To a development corporation. For cash. They're tearing it down next month. She let the paper drift from her fingers. It fluttered down the steps and landed at his feet. "They're going to build a complex of low-income condominiums here. A place for people who need a home, not a monument to their own arrogance." This was it. The true revenge. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the car. It was about annihilation. She hadn't just stolen their inheritance. She had taken a bulldozer to the very foundation of their identity. The house, the symbol of the Covington dynasty, the source of all their pride and entitlement, was going to be reduced to dust and replaced by everything they disdained. "A legacy of cruelty," she stated, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's sentence. "Deserves to be bulldozed." Thomas made a sound, a wounded animal noise of pure despair. He sank to his knees on the grass, his hands clutching his head, unable to process the scale of his ruin. Chloe stood frozen, a statue of shattered avarice, her face ashen. Through the devastating tableau, Elizabeth saw a movement near the side of the house. Leo. He had been watching the whole time, hidden in the shadows of the rose bushes. He looked at his parents, his face a mixture of pity and revulsion. Then his eyes met his grandmother's. In them, she saw not triumph, but a quiet, shared understanding. Elizabeth looked at the magnificent car, the object of so much desire and pain. It meant nothing to her. It was just a tool, and its job was done. "And the car?" she said, her voice softening for the first time. "I don't want it." With a fluid motion, she tossed the keys in a high, glittering arc across the lawn. They landed in the grass, right in front of a stunned Leo. He looked down at them, then back up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's yours," Elizabeth said, "on one condition." Leo looked at his parents, kneeling broken on the lawn. He looked at the house that was no longer a home but a tomb. He looked at the open road that stretched beyond the manicured prison of Havenwood Drive. "You take it," Elizabeth said, her voice a promise of freedom. "You drive it far away from here, and you never, ever look back." She had not only disarmed her enemies, she had not only destroyed their past and their future in one clean, symbolic move, she had liberated the only person who mattered. She had given her grandson the one thing she had never had, a chance to escape. As Leo bent down and his fingers closed around the keys to his future, Elizabeth felt the weight of 50 years lift from her shoulders. She was no longer a ghost in her own life. She was the storm, and the air for the first time was clear. The air in Anya Sharma's office was still smelling of paper and a faint floral perfume. It was a space of quiet power, a stark contrast to the storm that had been Elizabeth's life. Across the polished mahogany table, David Chen, Thomas and Chloe's lawyer, sat with a posture of practiced confidence. He adjusted his tie, his movements crisp and efficient. He believed he was there to negotiate the terms of a surrender, Elizabeth's surrender. Anya, however, did not begin with a negotiation. She didn't open a file or present a counteroffer. She simply placed a small, discreet digital recorder on the table between them. Her expression was neutral, her eyes holding Chen's with unnerving calm. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice even, "my client, Mrs. Covington, has been accused of being mentally incompetent, of suffering from confusion, memory loss, and an inability to manage her own affairs. The petition you filed on behalf of your clients paints a rather vivid picture of a woman lost in a fog of senility." Chen gave a small, almost sympathetic nod. "It is an unfortunate situation, Miss Sharma. My clients are deeply concerned for their mother's well-being. This is about protection, not avarice." Anya's lips thinned into a line that was not quite a smile. "Protection. I see. Before we discuss the specifics of this protection, I'd like you to listen to something. It's a recording made just over a week ago. I believe you'll recognize the voices." She pressed a button. The small device came to life, and the sterile office air was suddenly polluted by Thomas's familiar grating voice. It was sharp, conspiratorial, laced with a contempt he didn't bother to hide. "Just string a few things together," Thomas's voice said, tinny and clear from the speaker. Her forgetting where she put her keys last week, the time she called the plumber for the cable guy, it's all ammunition. We just need to paint the picture for the judge. A confused old woman who can't be trusted with a checkbook, let alone an estate. Emphasize the grief. Say she's not herself. David, your man Chen, he said it's a slam dunk if we frame it as protecting her from herself. Then Chloe's voice, higher and more venomous. "And the social media stuff? Leo said she's been on the computer. We can say she's falling for online scams, that she's vulnerable. We just need the keys to the kingdom, Thomas. Before she does something stupid, like donate it to a cat shelter." Anya pressed the button again. Silence descended, thick and absolute. David Chen had gone perfectly still. The blood had drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy grey pallor, his practiced confidence shattered, collapsing inward like a building imploding. He stared at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly, deliberately lifted his gaze to meet Anya's. The pretense was gone. The professional mask was gone. All that was left was a man who knew, with chilling certainty, that he had been caught aiding and abetting a crime, aiding a disgusting, transparent, and now provable lie. He had hitched his wagon to two fools, and they had just dragged him off a cliff. He didn't speak for a long moment. He simply opened his expensive leather briefcase, his movements now stiff and jerky. He began placing his notepad and pen inside, not looking at them, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. "The petition for conservatorship," he said, his voice a dry rasp, completely devoid of its earlier assurance. "It's withdrawn. Effective immediately. I'll file the dismissal myself this afternoon." "I'm so glad we could come to an understanding," Anya said, her tone unchanged. She picked up the recorder and slipped it back into her pocket. The meeting was over. The fallout was not a loud explosion. It was a quiet, creeping rot that started from the inside out. In a town like Havenwood, reputation was currency, and the Covingtons had just declared bankruptcy. The first tremors were felt in the places where Chloe had once reigned supreme. At the organic market, she reached for a wedge of artisanal brie, her usual confident smile ready. But then she saw Carol, a woman from her tennis club, at the end of the aisle. Carol's eyes met hers, and the polite smile on her face froze, then vanished. Without a word, Carol turned her cart with a sharp squeaking sound and hurried down the opposite aisle, as if fleeing a contagion. Chloe stood there, her hand hovering over the cheese,
her face burning with a shame so hot it felt like a physical blow. Thomas felt it in the world of men, the world of handshakes and business loans. He had an appointment at the bank to discuss leveraging their home for a bridge loan, a desperate attempt to free up some capital now that the inheritance was gone. He walked in, expecting the usual fawning respect. Instead, the bank manager, a man he golfed with, was suddenly unavailable. A junior loan officer met him in a small windowless office, his demeanour cool and formal. The application was denied. Over-leveraged, the young man said, sliding the papers back across the desk.
Given the current volatility of your situation, the bank considers it too high a risk. The whispers started. Then they turned into open conversation. The demolition of the old Covington house was a spectacle, a public execution of a dynasty. Everyone knew, but the narrative was not the one Thomas and Chloe had tried to spin. It wasn't about a confused old woman. It was about two greedy children who tried to have their mother declared insane so they could steal her home. This narrative was helped along by a few carefully worded anonymous posts on the Havenwood Community Facebook page. Leo, from 1,000 miles away, became the town's avenging angel of gossip. Under a post asking why the old Covington property was being torn down, a new account named Havenwood Observer replied, "Heard from someone who knows the family that the kids, Thomas and Chloe, tried to get power of attorney to sell it and put their mom in a home. She found out and sold it from under them to a developer for a low-income housing project. Guess they won't be getting that inheritance after all." The comment exploded. Likes, shocked face emojis, and a flurry of replies. "That's horrifying. Poor Elizabeth. I never trusted Chloe. Always so smug. Serves them right. You don't do that to your own mother." Another post from Leo a few days later on a thread about a local charity event. "Funny how Thomas and Chloe Covington were chairs last year. Doubt they can afford a ticket this time. Heard they're having some financial trouble. Maybe they should apply to live in the new apartments being built where their family home used to be." It was vicious, it was surgical, and it was devastating. Within a month, a for sale sign appeared on the manicured lawn of Thomas and Chloe's own house, a stark, ugly symbol of their complete and utter ruin. They were not just socially ostracized, they were financially destroyed. The life they had built, on the expectation of Arthur's wealth, was a fantasy, and they had woken up to a nightmare of debt and disgrace. Elizabeth did not witness any of this up close. She didn't need to. She saw it all on one final day. She had returned to Havenwood for the last time to sign the final papers with the developer. As she drove away from the lawyer's office, she took a detour, a morbid curiosity pulling her down the familiar tree-lined street where her son lived. And there they were. In the driveway, amidst a scattering of cardboard boxes and packing tape, stood Thomas and Chloe. The moving truck was half full. Elizabeth pulled her modest rental car over to the curb a block away, shielded by the leafy branches of an old oak tree. She just watched. There was no shouting, no drama, just a profound, soul-crushing weariness. Thomas was trying to lift a heavy box labelled trophies. He grunted, his face red with exertion. It slipped, and the cardboard corner buckled, spilling a few tarnished high school football trophies onto the asphalt. They clattered with a tinny, pathetic sound. He stared down at them, not with anger, but with a kind of vacant despair, relics of a past that promised a future that would never arrive. Chloe was wrapping a gaudy, oversized crystal lamp in bubble wrap, her movements slow and clumsy. Their designer clothes looked out of place, her carefully maintained manicure was chipped. She looked up and saw Thomas staring at his fallen trophies, and a look of such pure, unadulterated contempt crossed her face that it was almost breathtaking. She didn't say a word,
She just turned back to her lamp, wrapping it with a bitter, furious energy. Elizabeth watched them, these two people who were her family, her flesh and blood, and she felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even pity. It was like watching a documentary about the extinction of a species she had once studied. The anger that had fueled her for weeks had burned itself out, leaving behind a clean, quiet, empty space. The fire had consumed the rot, and now the ashes were cooling. She thought of Arthur. This was his legacy, this pathetic, bitter scene. An empire of control and cruelty, built on a foundation of sand. It had taken nothing more than a quiet old woman with a secret and a grandson with a conscience to wash it all away. She had lost her son. She had lost the illusion of a family she hadn't truly had in decades. But as she sat there in the quiet car, watching the hollowed-out shells of her children pack up the hollowed-out remnants of their life, she knew she had reclaimed something infinitely more valuable. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, not looking back. The cost had been immense, a price paid in grief and severed ties. But the freedom spreading through her veins was priceless. Weeks bled into a month. The sharp, acrid smell of demolition dust and courtroom anxiety was replaced by the clean, constant scent of salt and rain. Elizabeth's new life was a small, two-bedroom apartment on the Oregon coast. It wasn't a mansion. It had no rose garden, no forbidden study, no ghosts. The walls were painted a soft sea foam green, and the largest piece of furniture was a comfortable armchair pointed directly at a picture window that framed the endless, churning expanse of the Pacific Ocean. This was her throne now. The silence here was different. It wasn't the oppressive, watchful silence of the Covington house. It was a living silence, filled with the crash of waves against the shore and the distant cry of gulls. It was the sound of peace. One afternoon, as a gentle mist rolled in from the sea, her phone buzzed on the small table beside her. It was a video call. The name on the screen made her heart give a small, happy leap. Leo. She answered, and his face filled the screen, grinning, the wind whipping his hair. Behind him, the background was a staggering panorama of red and orange rock under a vast, impossibly blue sky. "Hey, Grandma," he shouted over the wind. "Check this out. It's a pretty big hole in the ground, huh?" He flipped the camera. Elizabeth gasped. The Grand Canyon. A breathtaking, terrifying, beautiful scar across the face of the earth. She could almost feel the scale of it through the tiny screen. "Leo," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "It's magnificent." He flipped the camera back to his own face. He looked different. The quiet, watchful tension that had always lived in his shoulders was gone. He looked happy. He looked free. "The Phantom loves the desert," he said, his eyes sparkling. "She just wants to run. We hit 100 on a straightaway in Arizona yesterday. It felt like flying." "Leo, be careful," she said, the old grandmotherly instinct flaring up. He laughed, a full, easy sound. I promise. Silas, your auction guy, he connected me with a classic car club in Phoenix. They showed me how to check the oil, the tires, everything. They called her a unicorn." He paused, his smile softening. "How are you, for real? What's it like, by the ocean?" They talked for nearly an hour. Not as grandmother and grandson bound by duty and family ties, but as equals.
Two survivors swapping stories from the front lines. She told him about the smell of the low tide, about the sea lions she watched from her balcony, about the surprisingly good clam chowder at a little cafe down the road. He told her about changing a tire in a Texas thunderstorm, about the taste of real barbecue in Memphis, about a girl he met who was hiking the Appalachian Trail. He was seeing the country, but more than that, he was seeing himself. He was no longer just the quiet boy in the shadow of his monstrous parents. He was becoming his own person, mile by dusty mile. Before they hung up, his expression grew serious. The wind died down for a moment, and his voice was clear.
"Grandma," he said, thank you." His eyes were bright. "You didn't just give me a car. You saved me from them, from that house, from all of it." "You saved me too, Leo," she whispered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. "You were the one who showed me I wasn't alone." They said their goodbyes, promising to talk again in a few days when he reached California. Elizabeth ended the call and set the phone down, her hand trembling slightly. She walked out onto her small balcony, pulling her cardigan tight against the cool, damp air. The sun, a pale disk in the misty sky, was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of soft apricot and lavender. She was alone. Utterly and completely alone, for the first time in over 50 years. But she was not lonely. The distinction was everything. Loneliness was a void, a lack. Aloneness was a presence. It was the presence of herself, whole and unbroken. Her mind drifted back unbidden to that word. The word Arthur had used like a whip, the word Thomas had hurled like a stone. Worthless. She tasted it on her tongue, a meaningless collection of letters. It had no power here. It couldn't curdle the salt air. It couldn't silence the waves. It couldn't dim the colours of the sunset. Arthur was ash. Thomas was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own making. The word was theirs, not hers. It had never been hers. She had just been forced to carry it for them. She leaned against the railing, the cool metal a solid presence under her hands. She was in complete control of her home, of her finances, of her future, of the simple, profound decision of what to have for dinner. It was a power so immense, so fundamental, that it felt like breathing for the first time after a lifetime of being held underwater. A smile touched her lips. It wasn't the brittle, polite smile she had worn for decades like a mask. It wasn't the grim, tight-lipped smile of her revenge. This one was small, genuine, and deeply peaceful. It was a smile of a rival. She had navigated the storm, and this was her shore. She looked out at the vast, endless ocean, at the open road of water that met the sky, and she felt the promise of it in her soul. A future, unwritten and all her own. The story of Elizabeth Covington isn't just about revenge. It's about reclamation. It's about the quiet strength it takes to rewrite a life that others have tried to finish for you. We all have moments where we feel powerless, where our worth is questioned by those who should value us most. What did you think of Elizabeth's final act? Was it justice, or did it go too far? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know if you've ever had a moment where you had to fight to reclaim your own story. Thank you for watching.